go. All right. Stream is going. All right, welcome. How are you guys tonight? Jay's Analysis Nerds. Got a super duper treat. Make sure that the sound is good. Can you guys hear me? Anybody there? All right, well, A plus. Yes. All right, Jim, let's do a little audio test. Can you hear me okay, Jim?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear. I hope I'm coming through as the same way.
All right. Can the audience hear Jim, everybody? Good? Can you hear Jim? Get the party started?
I can speak with a more stentorian voice if necessary.
The chat's always a little bit slower, so I want to make sure that A plus.
Yeah, you can hear that, but I can't, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Sounds like everybody says the sound is good. Mr. Jim Jatras is joining me tonight. He is a former US diplomat and a GOP Senate consultant. He's the author of many, many articles, many, many media appearances and interviews, and he is also Orthodox. So we are honored to have Mr. Jim Jatras. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Jay. Glad to be here.
So maybe before we jump into all the deep geopolitics and the theology, I was listening to some of the interviews that you did where you talked about your background and where you came from, and maybe tell us how you came to Orthodoxy. I think you said you've been Orthodox for 10 years, or was it that you've been teaching Inquirer's class for 10 years?
Inquirer's class for 10 years. No, okay. I'm a cradle, not a convert. My family, my parents were both born in the United States, but all four of my grandparents were from Sparta. My dad's a retired U.S. Air Force officer, a fighter pilot. And I do have to say, though, I have a lot of empathy for converts because in some ways I think my formation is closer to that than to many cradle Orthodox. Because of my dad's profession, I didn't grow up in the typical Greek American community. The closest thing I have to a hometown is Bitburg Air Force Base in Germany. And so, and I have to say, honestly, we didn't really attend church all that much in my youth. A lot of times there was not an Orthodox church nearby. If we did go to church, it was often to the Protestant chapel on the air base. And I think my parents, they grew up in they were born in the early 1930s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. So, that was the sort of the era of peak American assimilationism, the idea that, oh, yeah, well, we're Greek, but, what difference does it really make? Mm-hmm. So I don't think they really thought about those things much. And I didn't think about those things much. So I was just, in many ways, just a typical American Air Force brat, growing up. And I don't think I really started thinking about these things at all till I went to college. Oddly enough, I lived in Greece for a year and a half. I met my wife when we were in Greece because she was similar to me, a Greek-American origin. Her dad is signed there as well. And only when I got to college and for some reason got connected to the Orthodox Christian Fellowship and began to realize, gee, there's other people out there that come from an Orthodox background and they're not Greek.
Yeah.
We were serviced there at Penn State by an OCA priest from nearby. And I think then somewhat after that, especially after I got into law school, I went through what you might call the young adult crisis of existence. And, what's it all about? And at that point, I think I became serious about being not only a Christian, but specifically an Orthodox Christian. So that was probably in the late 1970s. So I would say about the time I was, in my early 20s.
Excellent. And so, yeah, I was delighted to hear that you are an Inquirer's class teacher. So it's great to have somebody who is in the sphere of the geopolitical and studying that, but also grounded, in solid theology. I've watched some of your discussions on Twitter and your stuff. So a rare breed of both of these worlds colliding, and glad to see you out there doing what you do.
Well, I appreciate that. All I can say is I try, as we know from these discussions, especially on Twitter, which obviously is not necessarily the best
Not the
format
best medium.
for these
Yeah, right.
discussions, is that I hope I convey, especially to some of our, well, obviously to both Protestants and Catholics, the need for us to try to be as humble about our ability to apprehend an objective reality and to describe it and be faithful to it the best way we can, without thinking because you or I are so smart we've got it all figured out. And I think, unfortunately, given the tendency toward logic and rationality and intellectualism in Western Christianity, that's been the norm since scholasticism, and certainly is true of a lot of Protestantism. And I was criticized for some people saying how much similar, at least in my mind, Roman Catholics and Protestants are, because they basically agree on one critical point, which is that only one man is infallible. For the Roman Catholics, it's the Pope. For the Protestants, it's me. And everything comes down to that, because it all goes through the cognitive process, and that's the final authority somewhere. And for us, it is not. To try to explain that the authority is the church herself. It is the body of Christ. It is the Holy Spirit in the church. And so you get these appeals to authority. Well, who decides that? Who's the guy with the funny hat who gets to make the final decision? When you try to say the final decision is made by Christ, it's made by the church as a whole. For you and me, that doesn't absolve us of our responsibility. It puts a terrible responsibility on our shoulders to try to be, with humility, to be in accord with that. And that is so hard to explain to people who are brought up in this whole rationalistic approach to Christianity.
Yeah, there is definitely two extremes that you could fall down on. I mean, I know that it was a big challenge for me, and one thing that kept me from Orthodoxy for many years was the difficulty of understanding. You would hear this kind of mantra repeated in a way by Orthodox people, that Orthodoxy is not primarily intellectual. It's more so a transformation of the person. And that's not to say that that's all that it is, because there is an intellectual component, and this can be overlooked as well. You can kind of have a reaction of pietism where people say that, well, the dogmas don't matter, and it's just this kind of existential thing. But really, it's a matter of holistically having all of those things together in the right order. So the intellect isn't completely done away. It's actually transfigured, but it's put under the hierarchy of the nous or the heart. So that we have to have the transformation of the inner man, the heart, before the intellect can be fixed. Otherwise, the intellect will kind of try to steer things, and that's where you've seen Western civilization go, is in this direction of pure intellectualism, which has led to rationalism and atheism.
Sure, absolutely, and I think that's unfortunately become the norm in our world today. And the irony is that when it gets to its final endpoint, all that intellectualism and rationalism turns into crass superstition and magic.
That's a great point.
I remember seeing something written by Stephen Hawking, who by all repute is a really smart guy, or was a really smart guy, maybe the smartest man who ever lived. And he wrote an op-ed piece saying that God could not have caused the Big Bang, because because time started with the Big Bang, and since there was no time before the Big Bang, there would have been no time for which God could have caused it. And I'm thinking, how could anybody that smart, and even having a passing acquaintance of how we define God, have said something so absolutely dumb? And then he turns around and believes in things like multiverses. That universes are popping in and out of existence all the time, out of nothingness. Yeah. And you're calling us superstitious?
Exactly.
It's just bizarre in my opinion.
Yeah, but Dawkins can say, well, there's aliens that perhaps seeded us here. Yeah. We're panspermia. We're seeded by aliens. But no, the existence of a God. Well, that's crazy.
Of course, where the aliens come from. It's just kicking the can down the ontological road there.
Exactly, right. So let's get into the theology a little bit later. But so I wanted to. So the first thing that I encountered in your tweet stream and at your website, and then over at Strategic Culture and different places, Chronicles magazine, where I've seen your articles. Yeah. You write a lot about geopolitics. So let's start maybe with a little bit of that, get into the worldly stuff, and then we'll progress later over into the more otherworldly stuff. So Iran, you have made many good points in a lot of the interviews I watched where you talk about the designation of Iran as a terror state. Is this really to just placate neocons, or do you think Trump actually believes this? This is what I can't figure out. What does Trump actually believe? Or is he going along, or is he really knowing what's going on? I keep getting confused. I can't figure out what's.
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if anybody knows the answer to that question. I'm not even sure if he knows the answer to that question. But hey, look, a lot of people, including some people who I know and respect very highly, have become very, very hostile to him, believe he's simply just a shill for whoever is running things, that it was all a fraud from the start, that he's just another water carrier for the same con game that the rest of politics is made up of. I tend to think that that's not the case, if only because why does he make so much trouble for himself coming out and saying things about wanting to get along with the Russians? I don't want to have a war with the Iranians. I don't want to have a war. He could just go along with that agenda overtly without. He could become Mike Pence. He could become Pompeo. He could simply adopt their line. Why kick against the bricks? I don't understand it. But he does. And I've heard other things from private sources that in a private conversation, he said the following, which makes you feel that he knows more or less what the score is and would like to do the right thing, but is powerless, maybe to a large extent because of his own doing, because, as I say, personnel is policy. You put the wrong people in, you get the wrong policies. He appointed them. He has to take the blame for that, but then other people will say, you probably have no idea what the constraints are on him and even on his people. I mean, look, I'll tell you, I knew a lot of people on the campaign in 2016, former colleagues from Capitol Hill. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want a job in the administration. I didn't want to even be part of the campaign operation. I just simply wanted to be helpful. I thought it was absolutely essential to Trump win, Hillary lose. And I was willing to you want some research, you need some help with talking points, you need, anything I can help you with, feel free to call on me. Yeah. And in fact, I even wrote about one of these episodes having to do with Trump's calling Hillary and Obama the founder and co-founders of ISIS. Yep. Which was absolutely right, because if you look, and as I spelled out, if you look at the DIA memo from Mike Flynn when he was head of DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, again, I won't go into all the details here. People can look it up. It was right there. The campaign wanted nothing of it. All they wanted to say was, well, what Trump meant was that Obama pulled out of Iraq prematurely. That's what he meant. Created a vacuum. The standard neocon line for this silliness. At that point, the entire campaign operation, at least when it came to national security, was already controlled by Bush retreads and neoconservatives, and just whoever off the shelf from the RNC and the Heritage Foundation. Right. And all I can say is, thank God I really didn't make any contact with these people, because all I could think of then is that I probably would have gotten a visit from Mueller's boys to try to trick me into some kind of a perjury trap to get a date or a name wrong, so I could, get the kind of treatment they've been meeting out to people. It's, so, maybe it's all providential there, Jay.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But the short answer is, I don't know the answer. I'm not sure anybody does. Can he fix it? If tomorrow he fires Bolton and puts somebody good there instead, look what happened though when he tried to appoint this Congressman Radcliffe to the head of Director of National Intelligence, who. He's as anti-Russian, anti-Chinese as anybody else, and a bit of a warmonger in his views, as far as I can tell. But at least he seemed to be willing to look at what was going on in those intelligence agencies and try to root out the poison. Well, Trump had to withdraw his nomination because he was being shot down in the Senate. So, I think whether his intentions are good or not is almost irrelevant, because functionally, once you're a wheel, you're stuck on the axle. All you can do is spin.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I get that question all the time, and the same question comes in in regard to Putin. I think Putin does a lot of good things, but I also think some things he does are not that great. So, I'm not really that interested in being forced into an either or. Well, you're either pro-Trump or you're anti-Trump. You're either pro-Putin or you're anti-Putin. I think that we can have a more realistic assessment of pros and cons, and then at the same time admit that I mean, politics, geopolitics is interesting. It has a degree of importance, but to me, it doesn't ultimately matter that much beyond sort of a passing interest. Just for me, but I know that you're in the world of politics.
I think it matters, Jay, if we all end up dying.
Well,
and
yeah,
that
that's
could
true.
that could be important if it comes to pass. And look, as far as Putin or Trump or Orban or anybody else in the world,
Right.
The scriptures say, "Trust not in princes" for a reason.
Yeah.
That ultimately their responsibilities are limited to a certain sphere of activities.
Yeah.
Sometimes they'll do good things, sometimes bad things, sometimes they're good men, sometimes they're bad men. In the end, bigger things are at work here, whether it's for a positive direction. Like, for example, let's look at the conversion of the Roman Empire under first St. Constantine and then later when Theodosius made Christianity the state religion.
Right.
Was it just those men and their ambition that made those things happen, or was it much deeper currents within society and within what God had, God's providence that caused things to happen?
Exactly. I think you have to have a bigger, wider scope, history view, and not get caught up in the minutia of the fact that these are human beings who are fallible. And I didn't mean to give the impression that I believe in some sort of obscurantism or that we should forsake the civil sphere. I actually believe that God instituted the civil sphere. I think that it's there. According to Romans 13, Paul says very clearly that Caesar has the sword under the ordination of God. Now, that doesn't mean that Caesar's God, but the civil state is instituted by God, and it's always been viewed that way in Orthodoxy.
Well, even what Christ said to Pilate, you would have no power except it were given to you from above. That all political power comes from God as well.
Right.
And it's sometimes I remember there was one emperor in the East Roman Empire, Byzantium, Phocas, who was considered a really bad emperor. And the popular saying among the people was the people had been sinners and needed to be punished, and Phocas was the worst he could find. And sometimes people had the idea that bad times also come from God, just like sickness comes to individuals, because that's what's needed at the time. I think we also have to understand, too, that in the big scheme of things, we also have the mystery of iniquity, that at the end of the day, the civil sphere is not going to produce something good.
That's true. But we do have examples of men who did stand out. I mean, if we look at, we have, Justinian. This is a great book I've been reading on the Christology of Emperor Justinian, who's actually a defender of the faith. And so we can have these kind of bright periods where people do execute their office in the right way. If you read the Code of Justinian, of course, this is very influential in Western and Byzantine law theory and so forth, which would go on to inform modern law. Anyway, point being is that we can't set up these kind of dialectics where we think that God is against the civil sphere, as some of the Protestant evangelicals do, and we also can't fall into the idea of statism as if the state can save us from these things. And these two mistakes are quite common in the history of Christianity. But so let me ask you a different question then, not so much on Iran, but I got a colleague of mine, Patrick Henningsen. He's very active in the Assange situation. And I'm curious what you thought about. Did Trump throw Assange under the bus? What was the deal with this, do you think?
I don't know. Patrick's a smart guy, and I know he's been following this very, very closely. Everybody remembers from the campaign, and of course, his opponents love to throw this at him. Oh, we love WikiLeaks. And that shows he was in bed with Putin, obviously, since WikiLeaks was working for Putin, which isn't true either. But in any case, I'm sorry to disappoint the listeners that I don't know whether he couldn't do anything about it or just doesn't care. I really don't. I did write a piece. This is where I jump off the Trump train.
Yeah.
That and maybe that's what prompted the question. At some point, you really do wonder if the guy's just helpless at all, or if he doesn't have his head screwed on straight. Either way, it's a disgrace that what's happening to Assange. And I just don't know what else to say about it.
Yeah, if they persecute him under national security, that'll be like the first time a journalist is persecuted under national security.
Well, he's not a journalist. He's the head of a non-governmental hostile intelligence agency, according to them. Yeah. So there you go. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, just redefine everything.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's I think indicative of the kind. And again, people will say it's Trump's fault. I don't think it's Trump's fault. I don't think he's doing anything about it. But if you look at, for example, what's going on in social media and so forth, the idea of free speech is becoming a very quaint anachronism. It's back for those guys in the powdered wigs and the knee breeches.
Right. What's the actual evidence that Iran is a terrorist state? We hear this bantied about all the time. Is there any actual evidence of, or is this just a weaponized designation?
I think it's a weaponized designation. Look, I mean, I'm not talking out of school when I say almost every major player in geopolitics supports terrorist groups now and then for one reason or another.
Right.
We have supported lots and lots of them over the years, usually Al-Qaeda offshoots in places like Bosnia and Kosovo and Syria and Libya and elsewhere. The Iranians get faulted for essentially Hezbollah, which is a militant Shiite group in Lebanon, which actually the Israelis had a hand in its rise in the first place because they sought to use Shiite militias as a weapon against the PLO, who was their main enemy at the time. And people say, well, Hezbollah committed the Beirut bombing in 1983 that killed all those Marines. Hezbollah didn't exist in 1983. Now, maybe some of the groups that were around at that time later became Hezbollah. And, maybe I'll make some people angry by raising the question, if you have foreign soldiers on your soil shooting at your villages from offshore from battleships, they're going to take some action against you. And, Reagan was smart enough when that happened not to double down, but rather say, what the hell are we doing there? And got out. And that was the smart thing to do. Are the things about Hezbollah? Look, let me get myself in trouble in another way. I've been very critical of Islam as a religio-political ideology. I don't think it's humane. I don't think it's tolerant. I don't think it's a good thing in very general terms. And to the extent to which Hezbollah and, for that matter, the Iranian government are militant Islamic states, I don't like their ideology. Does that mean every proxy they support in the region for their political interests is a, quote, terrorist? I don't know why the Houthis, for example, in Yemen are necessarily terrorists. They're mainly fighting against Al-Qaeda and ISIS that are being supported by the Saudis and the Emiratis.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So there's a real pot calling the kettle black here, and a question of to what degree and compared to whom. And I would say the Iranians are far less bad than a lot of other people. This number one sponsor of terrorism is just, we're way ahead of them, and the Saudis are way ahead of them.
I was going to say the Saudi regime, you've got centuries of the British Empire supporting terror. I mean, the U.S., for many, actually going back a century, the U.S. has actually been overthrowing regime change is not something that's unique to the Cold War. It goes back a long time, and a lot of writers have documented this.
In fact, I wrote an article about 20 years ago called the Muslim Advance in American Collaboration about our sponsoring of Islamic forces in the Balkans in the 1990s, and showing how this fit into a historical pattern. For example, the British supporting the Ottomans against the Russians in the Crimean War, even the way the papacy in Western Europe used the Turkish pressure on the Byzantine Empire to try to force us into union. There's been this odd symbiosis between some Western powers and militant Islam against Orthodoxy, and whether it was in the form of the Byzantine Empire or Imperial Russia, or against the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, which, even though it wasn't an Orthodox regime, obviously it was an Orthodox country in the majority, and then, of course, against Serbia and the Balkans. So I do think there's a pattern there where some people look at, and I know this is the case with the intelligence services here, they look at some of these groups as, at worst, frenemies. They're people who can be troublesome if they get out of hand, like they did at Benghazi, that the groups we were supporting and running arms to Syria through were the ones that killed those people at what was a CIA station, not a consulate. And that's just the cost of doing business with some rather sketchy
unsavory people. I did an analysis of Miles Copeland's book Game of Nations a couple years ago, the famous CIA operative, and he actually has many quotes that essentially say that very thing. It's like, well, that's just the nature of the game, is that we do have to use terrorist, but he says the terrorist is an expendable idiot, is more or less what he says. He says, but they're expendable idiots, but that's of course the dirty nature of the great game, and unfortunately, it's the way that it is. But you mentioned regime changes in a couple of the interviews that I watched with you, and you mentioned state-sponsored terror and how the U.S. really excels at this. Again, Miles Copeland backs that up in Game of Nations. Is it possible for the U.S. ever to accept a reasonable view where we don't practice interventionism? Can we roll back the CFR and its whole implementation of U.S. policing as an arm of globalism? This is essentially why the CFR came to be. Can we ever go back to that pre-CFR era of non-interventionism? Is this possible now that we live in a globalized world?
It's possible. Is it likely? I don't think so. I mean, just to give you a sense of how naive I can be in some ways, I remember when the first Cold War ended, the first thing I thought was, oh, thank goodness that's all over. The other crazy ideology from the 20th century has finally gone defunct, and we can get back to a normal world, more like a pre-1914 world, except with, some new players like China and India. And I have to say, surprised, and maybe I shouldn't have been, that rather than allowing such a world to come into existence, we basically made a bid for world domination, what Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol called benevolent global hegemony,
right,
in a famous 1996 article. And I don't know. I feel that unfortunately the American policymaking establishment, what people call the deep state and all that, and that term has been beaten to death. My good friend Mike Lofgren is the one I have basically popularized that term in his book, The Anatomy of the Deep State. It went from being an unknown term to a buzzword in almost no time. But I look at that, so much of our deep states, or whatever you want to call it, mode of operation is so similar to the old Soviet nomenclatura that it's very hard to escape the parallels between us and the situation of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Can they turn around? Yes. Do they have the internal machinery of this massive entity with so many components and so many people whose rice bowls get filled every day because of its operations? It just can't manage the turn. And even if somebody like Trump comes along, who at least pretended and maybe genuinely to run against it, he can't do anything about it. One gets the impression that maybe it can't turn around, it can't stop doing what it's doing, and there are only really two possible outcomes. One is it reaches its inevitable conclusion, which to my mind ends up having to be a global war, which, what can one say then? Or the other side, and at this point I think we're mainly talking about the Russians and the Chinese, but also to some extent the Iranians or the Venezuelans, whoever else is being targeted at the time, that if they can play rope-a-dope long enough and defend themselves, wear out our resources, cause some sort of financial collapse or some collapse of the dollar, I am somewhat mildly emboldened or heartened, let's say, by the fact that our threats against Venezuela, which should be a pipsqueak pushover, have failed, against Iran so far have failed, against North Korea have failed. Maybe we're getting close to the point where it becomes clear that the emperor has no clothes, that we can't push the button. We can't go much beyond where we've gone without causing a major collapse or conflagration, and that maybe some people at the Pentagon are at least smart enough not to want to do that.
I want to remind everybody listening, we have a good crowd. We're talking to Jim Jatras. He is the former U.S. diplomat and U.S. GOP Senate consultant.
And that's former as well, by the way.
Oh, okay. Yes. Former, and now you are essentially just writing, correct? Writing and doing.
Yes, writing media. And yes. So after leaving government, after about 6.5 years in the diplomatic service, including service in Mexico, and then what was then the Office of Soviet Union Affairs, then I worked for 17 years in the leadership of the Republican Party in the U.S. Senate. Again, mostly on foreign policy issues, but other things like pro-life issues and a few other things. And then after that, I spent several years as an evil Washington lobbyist with a couple of law firms.
Well, I want to remind everybody, go ahead and smash like if you're enjoying this interview. I saw the likes are pretty low for having like 300 people live. So smash like and go ahead and give me a share if you would. Share that around. Spread this on social media. Let people know that we're talking to a great guy, Jim Jatras. So we were talking about the possibility of scaling things back in a globalized world, allowing other countries to have their own spheres of influence. This is seemingly not going to be allowed with the neocon perspective of imperialism. And then you brought attention recently to situations in Georgia. Is this another attempt to use the? It's almost like there's a program that goes into effect, and it's the same every time, where they will inject into a culture a bunch of agitprop, and then in comes these sexual subversion. We're here to liberate you, right? This open society kind of idea.
Yeah.
And it's almost like it's a technique that's used everywhere. It's like the same thing over and over and over. What do you think about that?
I think that's exactly right. And in fact, the term agitprop itself is from the Soviet lexicon. Right. And this is one of the reasons I think the problem is so intractable, because it's not just politics. It's not just about, big money for the arms manufacturers, that there is a huge ideological, moral component to it. It's the same one, by the way, that faces us here at home with all the silliness about transgenderism and all that other nonsense. I don't know if it's done because it's corrosive of other societies, particularly as we see being targeted the Christian societies and Eastern Orthodox societies in Eastern Europe that were under communism, and to some extent were shielded from this stuff because of that, because they were undergoing a different pathology at the time. But it seems that there's such a symbiosis, such a close link between the power projection and the ideological software that comes with it.
Yeah, exactly.
That there's really no separation to it. I mean, if you want to be our friend, you have to not only cooperate with us on security policy and essentially be our puppet against Russia or whoever it is. You also have to have a gay parade. You have to accept all of the ideological presuppositions that come with that. And I don't see that being abandoned either, especially since, as we know, for example, from the seemingly interminable June Pride Month, every huge corporation is cock-a-hoop with this stuff. It's a big part of their corporate ethos now, it seems. So it seems to me that whether we're talking about the corporate world, the government world, everything is all pointing in that direction. And I think it has been weaponized as something that will disrupt the social and political patterns of these countries. Whereas the Soviet Union was exporting peace, progress, and socialism as they defined them, we have democracy, human rights, and free markets, and human rights includes all of this stuff because we say so.
Yeah, it's not really human rights. Those are just buzzwords and terms that cover the new way of doing soft power and pushing buttons and influencing these other cultures to go, nudging them in certain directions. I think of Gene Sharp and his whole idea of manufactured revolutions, basically. And like you said, we know that agitprop, this goes back to the Bolsheviks, but one thing that's really amazed me is as I studied a lot of the sort of the psychonauts and the Aldous Huxleys and these kind of characters, they actually sort of understood this same idea that the revolutionary ethos that actually goes back. I mean, you could trace it back to different points in history, but if we go back to the French revolutionaries, we saw all this same sort of degeneracy sort of unleashed by the French revolutionaries, and it's the same revolutionary impetus of the last several centuries. I think it's the same spirit behind this.
Right. And this is where I think, again, to some extent, there's a nexus to the religious situation, because and again, I don't mean this to be unfriendly to our Western Christian friends, but this is all a product of their civilization, not ours. In other words, that if you look at, there's an interesting book written by Eric Vogelin in 1952, The New Science of Politics, and he talks about the Gnostic tendency within society, but he's really talking about primarily in Western European society, where you had these various outbreaks. And as you say, the French Revolution, the Enlightenment, and I think ultimately now to the degradation we see now, these are essentially, I think, the toxic byproducts of the decay of Christianity in Western Europe.
Absolutely.
One of them, by the way, was communism, and I think one reason communism was successful in Russia is that there wasn't the resistance to it. That it was kind of like smallpox ripped through the New World after the Europeans got there. That the immune defenses didn't exist in that society against this imported ideology. And I think much in the same way as, say, 500 years ago, Western Europe and the papacy saw their ideological mission as imposing Roman Catholicism on the East. I think today it's a much broader phenomenon where the post-Christian godless pathologies have the same missionary zeal to target the rest of the world. You notice, by the way, they target primarily conservative Christian countries in Eastern Europe, mostly Orthodox, but also Catholic. In the case of Poland, for example, they're not doing it in Muslim countries. They're not doing it so much in the Far East even. They're maybe a little bit doing it in Africa. Where's the primary target? It's in Christian conservative country.
Yeah, no, this was Brzezinski even hinted at this when he talked about the arc of crisis that he wrote about, and he was talking about the transformations that America would have to initiate across the globe, especially in the Baltics and the Balkans. This arc of crisis that he talked about. He said terror would be a big part of this. And of course, overcoming communism, he claimed, but actually, what it's overcoming is not the communism to implement freedom, but it was actually to transition the world into what Brzezinski is known for, this whole idea of the technocracy, which he really pioneered in his books. But he's amazing to read because he's just so forthright and very clear about, even to the point in Between Two Ages, he says we got to co-opt these big religious institutions like the Roman Catholic Church. We could turn that as an engine basically for Americanism. And one of the things that I think is such a key piece to understanding Vatican II and the geopolitics of the Vatican, which a lot of people miss, is David Wimhoff has a great book on John Courtney Murray and the CIA's doctrinal warfare program using the Catholic Church. It fits perfectly into Brzezinski's analysis of how to utilize these big religious institutions to promote Americanism. And by Americanism, he means the things that we're talking about, the open society, this kind of stuff is what he's talking about. It's not about freedom and dignity. That's the cloak for this other stuff that we're talking about. That's the real subversion.
And that's right. And I hate to say it, and maybe I hope this is not too much of a digression, but I think this is also where we have to be very vigilant about what's happening within our own church on a couple of fronts. One is everybody is, I've written quite a bit about the problem in Ukraine between Moscow and Constantinople and the so-called autocephaly and all the rest of it, and Constantinople's determination to legitimate these schismatics in Ukraine. Clearly, this is the State Department is overtly supportive of all this, that the International Religious Freedom Ambassador, Sam Brownback, former governor of Kansas, was all over Eastern Europe several weeks ago, bending the ear of politicians there to try to get them to make their churches recognize the Ukrainian schismatics as canonical. Mr. Pompeo has been overt about this. Unfortunately, this is part of American foreign policy as well. And that seems to have its roots going back some ways, at least until the 1940s, when the Truman administration was instrumental in installing Patriarch Athenagoras in place of, I think it was Patriarch Maximos at the time. And some would say even goes back to the British intrigues at the time of Patriarch Meletios IV and the introduction of the new calendar and a lot of other things that were going on in the wreckage of the Russian Revolution and the horrendous persecution that church was undergoing at the time. So, I think a lot of Americans would assume that, by the way, it only occurred to me in the last few days that, remember when Bob Simon of 60 Minutes did an interview with Patriarch Bartholomew? This is about 3 or 4 years ago, I think, and I think many of us were looking at it and said, how wonderful, we're finally getting some good press, some recognition from even mainstream media. This is really a great thing. And then I began to wonder if this is part of the cultivation of the American establishment of the ecumenical patriarchate as as you say, with regard to the Vatican, of course, the Fun Hour and the Vatican are very close.
Yep.
So there's a lot going on there. I think a lot of it is out of public view.
Right.
But I think it's very worrisome, especially when then you add to that some of the academic handmaidens that are going along with this. You have places like Fordham University and Marymount Loyola, funded by Michael Huffington. You're always pushing the same post-Christian moral agenda, like LGBT, that we've seen has destroyed the Western confessions. I don't know how it all ties together, but I'm confident these things are connected.
Yeah, this is why Wim Hof's book is so key, because he takes a wide scope picture to the 20th century, and he says, look, there is a formula here. There's a pattern that we can notice. He's explaining what happened in the Roman Catholic Church. He's a lawyer, a traditional Catholic himself. 800 pages, 1,000 plus footnotes, well documented, demonstrating very clearly that it's not just a matter of, we can talk about, the Masons infiltrated the Vatican and this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
There is a relationship to that. But again, Wim Hof's thesis is so key because he understands the geopolitical influence of the CIA in terms of co-opting the Catholic Church to become the American Catholic Church, to then promote Americanism through the means that you're talking about, where we see places like Fordham University. Now, Fordham is a Jesuit university. John Brennan is a former attendee of Fordham. The point is that it's not going to be any different. It's very easy, once you recognize the pattern, to understand how the subversion and the control occurs, whether it's the Roman Catholic Church or the way that they're trying to do it in Orthodoxy. They're less successful when it comes to Russia and other patriarchates. The Greeks and the ecumenical patriarchs seem to be a lot more amenable to Western interests. And so for many years, people have been pointing out that he's essentially became or always was, who knows, kind of a tool of NATO and U.S. foreign policy. And then when you see the ecumenical patriarch writing books about the green agenda with Al Gore and Joe Biden and people like this, it becomes very clear.
Yeah, and establishing this concept that I'm in the Greek Archdiocese, my Archbishop Elpidoforos, this notion of not primus inter pares, but primus sine paribus, so that not first among equals, but first without equal. Yeah. This clearly neo-papal agenda coming from Constantinople, from a city that's a rotten borough. There's no there left.
There's hardly
anymore.
There's hardly any.
Yeah, and instead of worrying about building his own flock, or even there's a gentleman on YouTube, the Real Med White, he's called. Yeah. He's a Turk by origin. I think he's a great guy. I've talked to him, and he being a Turkish Muslim, wanting to become an Orthodox Christian, trying to find the way in, knocking on the door, nobody interested here. They don't even have their website in Turkish. Why are there more Roman Catholics and more Protestants, Turks in Constantinople than there are Orthodox Christians? Yeah, it makes no sense.
Well, I mean, giving Joe Biden awards, the pro-abortion politicians awards. I mean, this is really extremely scandalous, and that I think shows that you're seeing a real subversion.
Well, and in fact, my first real brush with fame or infamy, depending on your point of view, was in 1988 when I had a very public campaign against Michael Dukakis as the first Greek Orthodox candidate, who I had the very overt support from the Greek Archdiocese here, because they weren't preaching Orthodoxy, they were preaching Greekodoxy. Wow. They were supporting him out of ethnic pride. Now, there was a split within the church, but I would say most people were supporting, he's a Greek candidate, isn't it wonderful? And I didn't think it was wonderful at all. And
Well, you've been at this a lot longer than I have, because I remember being a kid, and I remember the Bush-Dukakis debates, and I had to write little analyses when I was in elementary school of the Bush-Dukakis debates. And isn't that where we heard, not gonna do it, no taxes, and then isn't that where that came from?
Would be prudent. Yeah, exactly right. And of course, Dukakis. I mean, of course, the Democratic Party's gone far further than that now on things like abortion. Right. But at his time, he was way on the fringe. When he was a legislator in Massachusetts, he not only introduced bills for legalizing abortion, which had been illegal, he introduced bills for legalizing bestiality and a few other things that had been on the books for a long time. Wow. And I think the explanation was that, well, this is just historical clutter. Why are they still on the book? Nobody gets prosecuted for that. That's probably true, and I'm not sure, how you go about prosecuting something like that, except maybe it's cruelty to animals or something. But why would you bother to want to take it off the books? What's the moral or social value of taking the prohibition away?
Yeah, well, I think some of these people are objectively evil. I mean, in the sense of they really actually want to further evil, and we know that. I mean, what's been coming out in the news recently with Epstein and all this stuff. A lot of the stuff that I've talked about for a long time is being vindicated. So, did you see by chance on that topic Bill Gates talking about? And I'm not. I can't tell if Bill Gates was being facetious or serious. I could literally see it going either way, where he was saying that, yeah, I used to be around Steve Jobs when he would do his rituals. He was very into doing rituals and ritual magic. And I couldn't tell. I mean, literally, Bill Gates talking about this the other day. It was, and I was like, is he being serious or is he making jokes? But he was making the claim, at least, that Steve Jobs, took his occultic sort of new age magic practices very seriously. So I think that some of these people are it's not all jokes. Some people do take this stuff serious.
Well, it's once you get to the certain point of spiritual bankruptcy, you don't know what kind of influence is going to become present in somebody's lives. That let's be clear, it's demonic. And right. Demons are real. Right. They have an influence on people, and most of them are not going to parade it in public. They will, keep it behind closed doors. But it's very powerful and very dangerous stuff, and we don't really know what some people are into.
Yeah. I did have one, let's say, a couple other questions about geopolitics before maybe moving into the spiritual stuff. But did you have any insight on or analysis of the Khashoggi death and the connection, the allegations of Adnan Khashoggi being in the sphere of Epstein? And the reason I say is because I did read some interesting things about Adnan Khashoggi and being the weapons dealer and all this kind of stuff. And then it turns out that I think Epstein had a connection to him back during the Iran-Contra days.
Wow.
I don't know if you've heard any of that. Or
I never heard about the Khashoggi Epstein connection. My understanding with Khashoggi is that his ties were on several points. One was Saudi factions hostile to the current de facto ruler, Mohammed bin Salman. Mm-hmm. And that his connections with that Saudi faction were also toward the Muslim Brotherhood, who is out of favor with bin Salman, MBS, and that his connections also, again, through the Muslim Brotherhood, are also very close to the CIA.
Western intelligence.
And the Washington Post are very, very, very tight as well. Yep. So I think he was in the CIA, Washington Post, Muslim Brotherhood, Saudi faction versus basically MBS and the Bibi and Netanyahu faction, who have different priorities.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
And now, why MBS decided to kill him, I don't think is. And of course, I can't help but think of the G20 meeting where Putin goes over to MBS and they're high-fiving and they're making a big show of being friends while everybody else is pretending they don't know MBS. And my first thought was, why are people so shocked? You think he was the only killer in that room?
Yeah, exactly right.
And meanwhile, he's killing half of Yemen. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
So, why is everybody so fussing over this Khashoggi fellow who, maybe he didn't deserve the
Yeah, suddenly everybody cares about that, right. Yeah,
it's how horrible,
Right.
So I think that's probably coming from some faction of the establishment that, wants to get all upset about that. Whenever you see something that is not particularly significant being, the bloody shirt being waved all over the place, you have to ask yourself, okay, why?
Yeah.
Whose ox has been gored? Whose interest does this serve?
Exactly. That's a good way to tracking down the clues as to why this is out there. That's a good point. I think also Denisenko, our schismatic so-called patriarch, I didn't even realize that he was invited to talk at the Atlantic Council. I think you pointed this out. That was
yes.
And then and Russia, I believe, has my friend was saying that Russia has booted the Atlantic Council. That's good news.
It is good news. I mean, the Atlantic Council, of course, they sucked in a lot of government money and a lot of money from the various military contractors and so forth. They are it is amazing how many. I will turn it around. It's amazing how few non-governmental organizations are actually non-governmental organizations. They're all what they call quangos, quasi non-governmental organizations, which means they're essentially fronts of one sort or another,
Right.
Government interest or various consultants and contractors for the government. It's again just part of the establishment.
Yeah.
And no, Atlantic Council is on the forefront of this, and they were certainly Johnny on the spot in pushing the Ukraine narrative,
Yes.
even before Constantinople pulled the trigger on it.
Great point. Where do you see? Let's one last question on geopolitics. What's the lay of the land here? You mentioned the possibility of war. I didn't really think we're going to see the Iran war because this pops up in the news. It's like the North Korea thing. Like every summer, North Korea is going to nuke us, and this is all a bunch of nonsense. Usually, is that the same thing with Iran, or is there a real possibility with this?
I think there's a real possibility. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I probably agree with you that it probably won't happen, but I don't know how high that probability is. I'm not one of those people who says, no, it wouldn't happen because it would be a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes disasters happen. Let's remember, above all, these people are not omniscient, and they make mistakes. And they may have in mind a scenario where they can pressure the government of Tehran enough that it collapses, and we can parachute the MEK, terrorists, in to take their place. And we don't need to go to war. We don't need to repeat the Iraq War or even the Libya War.
Yeah.
But so we can force a collapse from the outside, but they may goof. They may make a mistake. They may do something. One of the problems with, and remember, this is warfare, even if we haven't yet gotten to the shooting phase. One of the problems with warfare is that the enemy gets a vote. He doesn't necessarily react the way you think he's going to react. Something could happen that nobody anticipates. It turns into a shooting war and then escalates, and everybody says, whoa, how did that happen? And even if nobody intended it, and I don't rule out, by the way, there are some people who might intend it. I don't have much hesitation to say that Bolton and Pompeo would be willing to risk war and maybe even precipitate a war if they thought it was necessary to achieve regime change.
Right.
I don't think that's their preference, but I think they would be willing to go that far. I just hope there are enough people at the Pentagon who are just going to draw the line and say, no way, Jose.
Well, they didn't get the regime change in Syria, the staged chemical attacks and all this nonsense. Yeah. Are they going to kind of skirt back around and try that again?
I don't know what they might. By the way, I don't think they've given up on Syria, even though any sane person realizes that Assad has won. They of course, Trump still says he wants to pull out. We're still there with at least a couple thousand troops.
Yeah.
Which groups we're supporting there still, I don't think anybody quite knows. Supposedly they're not terrorists; they're just moderate head choppers. So who really knows? They all share the same ideology. I think we are still in a sort of a full spectrum between Lebanon and Iran as the target for this. We've got a real problem with the Iraqis who are not playing according to the script, even though they're not really an independent state. They clearly want to side with their co-religious in Iran. They are cooperating with the Syrians and the Russians as well. It's a big problem, and I think the way these people here look at it is the key to it is Iran. You take Iran down, everything else will fall into place. So maybe instead of rolling it up from the other end, starting with Syria, they can try to find a way to have a regime change in Tehran, and that will take care of the problem.
Yeah, it seems like we're there. There's still the idea of being guided by dispensationalist ideology, and America representing this kind of goofy evangelical thing, roughly speaking, and the end times are going to be about the Middle East and Islam, and now that could be, but it's not going to be in the scheme and from the worldview of the dispensationalist evangelicals. That they're not the ones that are correct if it is an end time situation. But I want to remind everybody in the chat we're talking to former US diplomat and former US Senate GOP consultant, Mr. Jim Jatras. Many articles. I'll have his links in the description here in a moment where you can find him at. The Jim Graham, is that the best place, or over at Strategic
No,
Culture?
no, Jim Graham. I really haven't done my best way.
Okay.
The way to reach me is on Twitter at Jim
Okay.
Jatras.
So I'll put
Yeah.
his Twitter in as well, but for your articles, the best place is what?
Yeah,
Strategic.
best places to go to either Strategic Culture Foundation
Right.
or to Chronicles Magazine.
Okay, and he's got many interviews you can find on RT, dealing with Iran,
Yeah,
dealing with
just
this.
go to YouTube, put my
Yeah.
name in, and all sorts of stuff comes up.
And so also, if you want to ask Jim a question, feel free to leave your super chats there, and we'll deal with the super chats here towards the end. Let's move over maybe into some of the theological issues, because, as you pointed out, the theology is directly related to the geopolitics, which a lot of people might not think it really plays into it, but it's a big part of it. One thing I think that is sad, coming from a Western, being raised Protestant, and then having about a decade as a Roman Catholic before I got into Orthodoxy and reading Orthodox theology about 10 years ago, was the lack of knowledge on Byzantium. I studied medieval philosophy in undergrad and grad school, and Byzantium was like a footnote. I had to go and do my own research on Byzantium, and it's just very bizarre that this whole giant chunk of history is just sort of shuffled under the rubrics of Dark Ages. It's part of the Dark Ages and forgotten.
Exactly, and I think you went exactly where I want to go with this, because I think everybody remembers a few years ago Samuel Huntington, the late professor, about the clash of civilizations and all that. And I there was a lot in there I disagreed with, but I think he was basically making a valid point that there are very deep cultural currents that inform the country's behaviors. And I think, and he said one of the problems with America is that we don't know what our interests are because we don't know who we are.
Yeah.
That, and as you, as somebody you might say, as an ethnic American, and me as an assimilated American, to try to have an appreciation of who we are as a nation that goes back beyond the Declaration of Independence. America didn't come into existence with the Declaration of Independence. We had a couple hundred years of colonial heritage, or 150 years of colonial heritage before that, and several hundred years of English heritage before that, and before that the Roman Empire. The whole trunk of European civilization that goes all the way back at least to ancient Greece, maybe longer if you go back to the Middle East. And certainly the East Roman Empire was key to that. We tend to look at the more recent centuries in Europe where, Byzantium declined and eventually fell to the Ottomans. People forget that for the first Christian millennium, it was Western Europe that was the backwater. That Eastern Europe was the happening place, intellectually, civilization, and also in terms of political power. That the East Roman Empire was the big kid on the block back in those days, and I don't think you can really appreciate that. And if you don't have an appreciation of that, I don't think you really know what is the subtext of so much we believe as Americans. And in a certain way, as Orthodox Americans, we're outliers. Obviously, America was founded as a Protestant country, and I don't buy all the stuff about there were Freemasons running around and all that kind of thing, but the people who founded this country were overwhelmingly Christian and overwhelmingly Protestant. But I like to think that as Orthodox, we are custodians of an older and deeper tradition that lay behind their moral notions, their sense of right and wrong, and their concept of life. And so I hope it doesn't make us lesser Americans in that respect. I hope in some ways it makes us better Americans. But maybe that's just my hope.
That's an interesting take. I think that is possible. There's always the possibility. I think we could potentially see a revival of Orthodox Christianity. I think as Roman Catholicism continues to kind of decay, as the chaos kind of continues to ensue, we are seeing a lot of people looking in other directions. And I think that the Protestant world too is riddled. I mean, Orthodoxy has its problems as well, but the Protestant world is certainly riddled with people wanting a connection to history, and then they find when they go to Roman Catholic churches that connection is intentionally being thrown off, especially after Vatican II with all the.
Well, that's something that struck me too with one of a couple of tweets we were on together regarding Jones, Michael Jones. About Orthodox being state churches. Jones is a brilliant guy, but I don't think he knows anything about Orthodoxy or Orthodox history.
No.
That there's sort of this caricature of Christianity you find in the West in Christian history. Well, you had the Bible and the Apostles, and then you had Augustine, and then you had Aquinas, and then the Reformers came along and messed everything up. That's not the way it happened.
Right. No. In fact, we have to understand as well well, you kind of hinted at this earlier, but one big misunderstanding that I kind of had, a pill I had to swallow coming from the Roman Catholic sphere into Orthodoxy, was the idea that nobody in Byzantium, this empire that spanned the longest empire in history, nobody thought of themselves as Byzantines per se. They actually thought of themselves as Eastern Romans. They were the Romaniti. Romeoi, and they viewed themselves as Catholic. So the irony here is that everybody in Byzantium thought of themselves as Roman and Catholic, but not in the sense of the papacy.
They were Romans and Catholics, but not Roman Catholics.
Exactly. That's a great.
A Byzantine or an East Roman was a Roman by his political definition, a Greek culturally and spiritually an Israelite, and that's the way they thought of their identity.
Right.
And I don't know. It's just that even at the time of the Greek Revolution in the 1820s, the Greeks didn't call themselves Greeks. They didn't call themselves Hellenikos. They didn't call themselves Hellenes. In fact, they were kind of appalled and confused when these people like Lord Byron would come there and call them Greeks, Hellenes, which in their lexicon meant pagan. They called themselves Romaikos. We're the Romaic people.
Wow.
And in fact, even to this day, the Turkish word for Greek is Rum. They call us Romans.
Yes, this is a great point because this is the idea, at least, it wasn't always followed, of Byzantium as the political expression of the religious ecumene of the Orthodox Imperium. And that's the proper mindset, what you're talking about. That way, what we have is a balance between the ethnos within the Imperium, just as you have a balance of the different liturgies within the totality of the Catholicity of the Church in universal communion. And so there's always that balance of the one and the many. And in my view, I really think the argumentation is there to show that when the triadic theology sort of got out of whack, that's when you also started seeing the political and the cultural expressions in the West and in Europe kind of go in a different direction. So you have the first.
When you say triadic, you mean the introduction of the Filioque?
Well, I actually see that as kind of a result of the simplicity doctrines. But yes, ultimately, the Filioque is just another expression, as St. Gregory Palamas says, of the error that St. Photius mentioned of this imbalance within the Trinity.
And of course, I do think there is a direct connection between those two things and the concepts of authority. Certainly papal authority, but the whole understanding of the relationship between church and state, church and society, that unbalanced in the West, as Thomas Aquinas said, that the Greek error that the Pope is not the head of the church is comparable to their error that the Holy Spirit does not proceed from the Son. Of course, he linked those two things, and I think that's one reason why it's so hard for not only our Catholic friends, but certainly our Roman Catholic friends or our Protestant friends, for us to say, well, who's the final authority of your church? Well, it's Christ. It's the Holy Spirit in the church. No. Right. But who's the guy? Who's the guy with the hat who can lay down the law? They just don't get it. Well, it must be an ecumenical council then. Well, yeah, but you don't often know if it was an ecumenical council until it's after it's over a long time, and we haven't had one since 787 anyway. Right. Well, it's the emperor. Then you have Caesaropapism. No, it's not the emperor either. If we were the emperor, we would have become Arians or iconoclasts or Roman Catholics when our emperors told us to do those things, and we wouldn't do them.
Exactly.
So it's not that either.
And also the history of the Frankish period, the Great Western Schism, that really makes the claim that the papacy transcends political power somewhat laughable, actually, when you really look at the not just the Carolingian period, but as it blossoms into the Great Western Schism. You've got three guys in France claiming to be the successor of Peter in a palace in Avignon. I mean, this is just absurd. To say that has no connection to the Frankish power is absurd. So Roman Catholicism is not immune to this problem of political power controlling and being part of the papal position, and as anybody else is. I mean, this is really a problem of the history of all religion. Really, it's a religion being used.
That's right. and I think that it's unfortunate. We have some of our Roman Catholic friends who criticize us for that lack of authority. But when you look at the wreck that their church has become with the Lavender Mafia and all that stuff, that even many within the official church, of course, we have our sedevacantist friends off on the side as well, who want to pretend the church they once knew still existed.
Right.
And I almost feel sometimes when I look now that our mess in Ukraine and some of these other things going on, that maybe Pope Francis called up his friend in Constantinople and says, hey, we've got some real problems here, and I think people might be inclined to desert and go over to you guys. Could you raise a ruckus over there too, so you won't look so good? Because,
yeah, exactly.
I can say we've had an influx of, you might say, Roman Catholic refugees in our parish. I'm sure they're at other parishes, sure, given their difficulties. Yeah. But clearly, what's going on in our church now, because of this mess in Ukraine, is it's not an attractive thing for us to display to the world.
Yeah. I was actually told by somebody that he a reliable source, that he believes that the actions of the EP actually are to test the waters to see if he could bring the ecumenical patriarchate and many Greeks with him back into communion with the papacy. And
that idea has been floated specifically with respect to Ukraine, where the new schismatic Orthodox Church of Ukraine would somehow have established communion with the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church.
Yep.
So you'd have the kind of a transitive communion between Rome and Constantinople. And see, I think people don't fully comprehend, certainly not a lot of our Roman Catholic friends, what a big problem that is for us. They say, well, why can't we establish? If you look at, you go to a Roman Catholic church and look at the book there, they give the communion discipline in there. They say that Orthodox Christians may receive communion there if compatible with the discipline of their church. Now, in fact, it's not compatible with the discipline of our church. For us, communion isn't just a disciplinary matter. Right. It is the criterion of Orthodoxy itself.
Yeah.
To receive communion there in the Roman Catholic Church would be essentially to leave Orthodoxy. I don't think they mean this badly. I think they understand that they don't fully understand that it's, for them, unity is being under the authority of St. Peter. For us, unity is being part of the same body. Mm-hmm. It is not. The criteria are quite a bit different. But I do think, unfortunately, this is what Constantinople has in mind. I think the problem is, and this is why I think Pope Francis has gone very slowly on Ukraine and has disappointed many Ukrainian Catholics, mm-hmm, because he doesn't just want to do this for Ukraine. He wants a much bigger chunk of the Orthodox Church, maybe the whole thing. And by the way, I do even worry a little bit about that Moscow has gotten a little too chummy, mm-hmm, in their dialogue with the Vatican as well, because they're trying to triangulate with Constantinople. Mm-hmm. I don't think they would ever go that far, because they would probably lynch the patriarch if anything like that happened in Russia. But there's a lot of things to worry about, I think.
I agree. Yeah. But once you see it, it's very obvious. I think that's the key, is that the patterns and the principles, the machinations, the subversion techniques, they're all the same patterns over and over and over.
Yeah.
And if we're paying attention, we can see it. And part of the reason for that idea in the Roman Catholic, they actually updated, after Vatican II, they changed and updated the canon law to where you could have these allowances of communion with people who previously 50 years ago were called schismatics and were damned, namely us, the Orthodox. There were theologians at the time of Vatican II who were making these arguments that we could have a new vision of the Eucharist as an ecumenical tool. And so they gained a lot of sway at the time of Vatican II. I read a lot of the Vatican II Periti and all these people. And so it's very inventive, and it's all about these different trends and whatnot. And one thing that I think really struck me with Orthodoxy is that Orthodoxy is the same. There's not a weird superstition where you're trying to mimic the wounds of Jesus over on this school of thought and then in this monastery, and then over here you're just trying to stare into the essence of God over here as a third order Carmelite or whatever. And then over here,
we don't even have orders.
I know.
We don't even have orders like they do. Yeah.
What appealed to me when you really learn Orthodoxy from the time of, say, you can go to Dionysius when he talks about the purpose of the doctrine of the energies, moving up into Basil talking about the doctrine of the energies, moving up into the Sixth Council and St. Maximus talking about the energies, and then all the way into the Palamite controversy. This is not just an abstract theological thing. It's about how we participate in the life of God. That's how we see and conceive of grace and experience grace as an uncreated reality. And that's universal in the Orthodox liturgy, the Orthodox confession, even in the rite of baptism. The priest calls down the energies into the font. I mean, we see it all through Orthodoxy during, especially the Sunday of Transfiguration and so forth. You see this pattern when we read the Sunday of Orthodoxy, the statements. If you read the anathemas, what's anathematized, there's what I'm saying is that there's a coherent unity from the time of Dionysius, the post-apostolic fathers, into Athanasius, into the 6th, 7th / 8th Council, all the way up into the Middle Ages, and to now. That continuity is, I think, one of the strongest arguments. Once you see it, once it clicks, when you see that it's there, that's one of the strongest arguments for Orthodoxy, as opposed to these many innovations and different. I mean, Roman Catholicism is all over the board. You can be a charismatic, you can be a Thomist, you can be all these different things, and there's not a unified conception of what the experience of the divine is. And Paul, I think, teaches that there is. We're all experiencing.
When we say experience of the divine, we don't just mean an emotional experience, like a Pentecostal meeting or something of this sort. That we understand that it's something that involves the mind, it involves the emotion, it involves the heart most of all, and it's not just spiritual; it's somatic. It involves the body as well, because the church is itself one divine body. And this is something I think our Protestant friends really have trouble with, because to them it's all up here. It's all about giving mental assent to a certain body of doctrine based on how I read these Bible verses, what this verse is saying to me. And of course, when you try to explain, it's not just going on in your head. It's life. It's the real experience of God in also a corporate form as His body on earth, which includes all of us. You could explain it to your blue in the face, but until the Spirit moves the heart, I don't think it can really penetrate the brain.
Yeah. And one of the great points too that I know you would agree with, that I try to stress to Roman Catholics, is that they'll often say, how can you know the faith? How are you going to learn the faith if you don't have the office of the papacy? And I think what they often forget, what really taught me Orthodoxy over the last several years of learning it and then attending it regularly, was the liturgy. The liturgy is the catechizer, and I think this is what Roman Catholics miss, precisely because of the alterations in the liturgy in Roman Catholicism. So they don't understand, unless you go to a Latin Mass, you're not understanding that everybody in the regular attendance of the Orthodox liturgical cycle is getting constantly catechized with all of the theology, even the really deep stuff.
Yeah, the sermon isn't the primary teaching part of the liturgy. And the liturgy itself is, I need to memorize this, guys. I keep forgetting who said it, but one of the books, one of the famous writers, might have been Meindorf or Schmemann, or one of them, said that the church is the body of Christ. The Eucharist is the body of Christ. Therefore, the church is the Eucharist. What makes the church is that we are one body within this one Eucharist. That's what ties us together. Not because some bishop, some emperor is the top guy.
Right. Exactly. It's more of a lateral notion than it is this like staring up at a pyramid.
We have a structure, but the structure doesn't make the church. We have a Bible. The Bible did not create the church.
Correct. Exactly.
The church is a living body. It has structure. It has bishops. It has a Bible. It has liturgy. It has hymns. It has all of these things, and that's all what makes the body. It's the nerves, the sinews, the bones, all the things, the blood that makes the body operate. But you can't reduce it to any one of those things.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that a rationalist or a person with that very, very strong either or Western dialectical mindset wants to do is reduce something to a simple definition on one layer, one level. The church is X, Y, Z, and if I don't see that in a syllogistic form, I will not accept it. It has to be either or. But it's more the theology is layered. The theology is not either or. When you look at the Christological controversies in the councils, they're very clear that they want to be balanced. They want to say, Christ is not only human. He's not only divine. He's a divine person who is also fully human. So that you find this balance throughout the theology. And what tended to be the case in both Roman Catholic and Protestant theology is strict dialectical tensions. Grace is set over against free will, right? God and his predestination is set over against
it's faith and works. It's
faith versus
it's matter
works.
and spirit. It's predestination versus free will.
Right.
It's one or the other.
Yeah.
And that's why I think they get frustrated with us. Sometimes they say, "What's the Orthodox view on this?"
Yeah.
Well, it's some of this and some of that.
It's a balance, right?
Yeah. And of course, the interesting thing is, none of those questions ever arose in the East, and nobody ever broke his head saying, well, is it predestination or is it free will? It's got to be one or the other, because we didn't have that kind of logical approach to the faith. It was more of an absorption of being absorbed in Christ and literally consuming Christ. That's what made us Christians, not can you define this, can you define that?
Yeah. Right. So I'm going to open it up. We're going to have Q&A. You don't mind a Q&A, do you?
No, not at all.
And again, we're talking to Jim Jatras, who is the former US diplomat and a former GOP Senate consultant. Been around for many years doing things many years before I was on the scene trying to talk about this stuff. I'm a noob, and we have a genuinely wise expert here. So put your super chats there in the questions section there, and I'm going to start with that. We have Foregone, $9.99. He says, Mr. Jatras and Jay, I appreciate this interview. When researching these topics, do you ever get overwhelmed? What are some of the activities that you do when you need to withdraw from a constant flow of information? I'll let you answer that.
Wow. I'm probably the wrong one to answer that question, because if I were smarter than I am, I would do that and know how to do it. And unfortunately, I don't. I am a bit of a news junkie, and reading various things, various analyses. And if I knew what was good for me, I would break it off sometimes and go read the fathers or spend time doing other things. But unfortunately, I don't know how to do that. So I commend the questioner for a very profound answer, the question for which I have only a shallow answer.
I would say I agree. Yeah, I'm easily distracted. I read a lot of things that are probably a waste of time. But
and you've seen in some of our exchanges on Twitter, I don't know when to quit, unfortunately.
It is hard.
I should quit. Yeah. I should block people sometimes. I should not respond to things. And sometimes I say, it's like coming back for more, even though I know I should. Maybe it's just a lack of discipline.
Yeah. No, I get baited into a debate, and I can't let it go. So that's one of my weaknesses, definitely. But I would say, try to every day. One of the things I found easy to do for me is the Bible audio. So that's very easy for me. I'm not saying to divorce it from church or the liturgy. I'm not saying that, but that kind of helps me, refocus, is to try to have Bible on audio easily accessible and constant. So that's my recommendation. Foregone. Moses Krieger, $5. Great discussion. This is definitely worth a super chat. I'm Orthodox, and I appreciate the conversation. Way better than debating loudmouth uniates. Yeah, that guy was a little loud. So this is a little more profitable because we're talking to somebody who's on the same team. But thank you for that, Moses. Ultimate Ideas, Canadian 5. Jay, I discovered your material and it has sparked an interest in Orthodoxy. Would you recommend Orthodox reading? What do you recommend as introductory reading beyond the Orthodox study Bible? Personally, I would say if you're coming from a Protestant background or a Roman Catholic background, Dr. Clark Carlton's books that he's written 2 books. Well, there's 3, but he wrote one, I think, for atheists, one for Catholics, and one for Protestants. So whatever your background is, Ultimate Ideas, Dr. Clark Carlton's book is a great introduction to, what is Orthodoxy different from, in what areas from Protestant or whatever your background is. That's my recommendation. And then I think the Orthodox Study Bible is great. We've been recommending that for a long time at Jay's Analysis. You teach the Inquirer's class for many years. What do you recommend, Mr. Jatras?
We have used different texts over the years. I'm not really married to any of them. We use Orthodox Church by Callistus Ware, sort of the basic historical thing, and then there's another one called Orthodox Church A to Z, I think it's called, by Father. I'm trying to remember what his first name is. His last name is Gruba, and we use that sometimes. It's fine. I think Carlton actually is excellent, but it's not as amenable for use as a textbook, I don't think. The other one that I would recommend to evangelicals would be Becoming Orthodox, because I think a lot of times people assimilate something if they're going through the same mental journey that the other guy did, saying, well, I was here, I thought this, and then it unfolds. And I think that's useful as well. For Roman Catholics, I can't really think of what maybe the history of the Council of Florence. I don't know.
Well, if you're a Roman Catholic, I would say Michael Welton's book is an easy start. It's not going to treat of every Roman Catholic issue, but it's going to be an introduction to the Orthodox view, and it's called Two Paths. That's a good one. Mm-hmm. Scro 83, $10. Just because you two of the best are right here. Well, thank you, Scro. I'll take that as a compliment. Appreciate that.
They can't call either one of us a bald-faced liar.
Bayes Chungus Bear, $5. What would be yours, both Jim and Jay's, criticism of the Russian Orthodox Church or Russia? And I'm not subverting you, I'm just curious. Jim, what would be your criticism of Russian Orthodoxy and Russia?
I think there's a temptation toward a certain formalism that say that the structures of the state, the structure of the church, can have too cozy of a relationship, that it creates room for corrupt people to pursue their own interests. I don't know if that's so much of a criticism as an observation. I mean, let's be honest. Back in the good old Byzantine Empire or Holy Russia before the Revolution, or merry old Anglo-Saxon England, let's not pretend that all these problems did not exist. Right. I mean, you read, we talked about the various emperors and some of them saints who saved the church from iconoclasm or this and that, but at the same time had people's eyes gouged out or killed members of their family, were driven out by mobs because their rule was so harsh. I do know there are some people who are Orthodox who are very critical of Putin. Well, he's an authoritarian, he's a thug, he's this and that, and that's a bad image for Orthodoxy. Hey, I don't think any of those things are true, or they're not as true as what people make them out to be. Mm-hmm. But then my second answer to that is, and which of the Christian princes we respect throughout history didn't have blood on their hands? That's part of their job.
Sure.
And their first job is stay in power, kill your enemies, pay the soldiers. That's part of what politics is about, is the church's role to save people in all situations in society, including some very rough ones, whether it's in war, whether it's, there's criminality around, there's corruption around. This is part of the human condition. So all of those things exist in Russia. I think that one of my biggest concerns is they haven't moved fast enough, in my opinion, on trying to do something about the horrendous abortion rate. It still remains very, very high in Russia. The church has voiced interest in doing that. Some politicians have done so, but they haven't really done much about it. And I understand that's something you can't do overnight. You have to condition people and so forth, but I think they really need to get cracking. They did it in Poland. I don't know why they can't do it in Russia.
I would say the best, I can't really speak. I've never been to Russia, so I can't speak to the state of anything there other than what's just in the media or whatnot. But I'm not really in a position to criticize the Russian Orthodox Church per se. But I would just say really the most apt criticism of churches anywhere would be to read Revelations 2 and 3, and the warnings that Jesus makes to the 7 churches of Asia Minor are really the best warnings to all churches. So that's the problems. I think providentially that's included, in Scripture, because the temptations of the seven churches of Asia Minor are the temptations that the church, always kind of faces. So leaving your first love, becoming lukewarm, tolerating degeneracy, those are all the kinds of things that we have to worry about for all churches.
But just closing that, by the way, I mean, aside whatever those criticisms are, I don't think we can overestimate the extent, first off, that anybody who has been to Russia, and I've been there many times, although I haven't been there, well, many times, probably about a dozen times. The last time was in 2012, but and I'm sure much has happened even since then. Anybody who was ever there during Soviet times and is there now, you'd have to be blind not to see that there's been a miracle. That you don't see, there's an old saying, any idiot can turn an aquarium into fish soup. Nobody knows how to reverse the process. Once you destroy a society, how do you fix it? I think it's remarkable the extent to which it has not been fixed, but certainly has regenerated, particularly in the visibility and the growth of the church. I can remember being on Red Square and people collecting to rebuild the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in the early 90s, and suddenly, boom, there it is. And some people say, yeah, but though that was a state church that was built to commemorate the defense against Napoleon, and Mayor Lushkov stole all the money to build it with state funds. And I say, yeah, isn't that great?
Yeah, agreed. Demetrios, $2. Jay, what is your view of and Jim of Western Rite Orthodoxy? I would say that in the some of the Antiochian parishes, it's a little too, quote, Western, in the sense that they have allowed things that, in my opinion, I don't think could be justified, like the Sacred Heart. I know that the Jesuits cooked this up as a means of enculturation. But I think if you read this book, which is a treatment by John McGuckin of St. Cyril, I think it's really problematic from the way that Cyril talks about Ephesus, or excuse me, the statements of Cyril at Ephesus, particularly point 8, where he talks about that we can't divide up the adoration given to Christ, but that it has to be given to the whole Christ.
Not in his humanity and not in his divinity. And this Father Michael Pomazanski touches on that in his book, Dogmatic Orthodox Theology, which is another great book, by the way, not necessarily for beginners, but it's really excellent, laying out the faith. I haven't had much experience with Western Rite Orthodoxy. I want to be for it, and I understand that it's, quote, part of the fullness of Orthodox tradition. I do have my concerns, and I don't know to what extent, and maybe this should not be a concern, people sort of come into it the way they would into an Anglican or Roman Catholic church and feel that they're not really in the Orthodox church, that they're still somehow in this Western liturgical orbit, and this is just another flavor of that. I hope that's
exactly. Basically, my concern would echo that with it. We don't want to give the impression that this is just another version of Anglicanism. It's not a means by which we can slip in papalism or ecumenism, and some of the practices of post-Tridentine Catholicism, like heart worship, like the Sacred Heart stuff, is, unfortunately, I would say, Nestorian, and is present in some of those Western Rite Orthodox churches, which doesn't make any sense. So maybe the Russian Orthodox churches that do the Western Rite are better than the Antiochians. I don't know, but that would be my concerns. Misty Ernst, $1. Thank you, Misty. Okay, so I have Jim's links there in the description. You can see his Twitter there. You can go follow him on Twitter. Great tweets. He's an active tweeter. He's out there making his case consistently on the.
In other words, he's an idiot. But
no. And then you see his articles there linked at strategicculture.org. You can check out his stuff. I don't see any more super chats, so thank you very much. I'm very honored, and I'd love to have you back. We can talk about some different topics as geopolitics progresses, or maybe some other theological topics in the near future.
Digresses, things get worse. Who knows?
Maybe not.
I hope.
But thank you for joining me, and it was an honor.
Thank you, Jay. It was an honor for me as well, and I look forward to doing it again sometime.
All right. God bless. Have a good night.